A December night 2018, and the snow is falling over the rooftops of Tallinn, a city where the streets go silent long before midnight. Somewhere inside one of those quiet apartments, a 63-year-old Englishman, with a voice too tender for the noise he once made, slips out of the world without a sound. He was the softest presence in punk, a man who never raised his voice yet left a scar on a generation. And when the news travels back across the sea, a certain kind of person stops mid-stride, feeling something they cannot even name. So what about the others? The ones who walked away at the very peak of their power? Where did they go, and what really happened in all those years of silence? In the winter of 1967, while London was still vibrating with the psychedelic colours of the summer of love, a young man with wide eyes and an endless well of strange melodies was reshaping the sound of a generation. Syd Barrett had formed Pink Floyd just 2 years earlier, and their debut album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, had already climbed to number 6 on the UK charts, a dizzying ascent for a band so radically experimental. The songs poured out of him like visions, whimsical and dark, tales of bikes and gnomes and the fragile edges of the mind, and the world seemed eager to swallow every last drop of his genius. But the machinery of fame was grinding hard, and the constant pressure of touring and performing began to warp the very fabric of his reality. He was taking LSD heavily, and the acid was not just opening doors of perception, it was burning bridges behind him, leaving him stranded in a place no one else could reach. As his behaviour grew increasingly erratic on stage and off, the other members of Pink Floyd made a decision that would haunt them forever. In April of 1968, barely 2 years after the band's creation, they asked their founder to leave. The silence that followed was almost absolute. Barrett retreated to his mother's house in Cambridge, England, and for the next 40 years, he simply refused to participate in the world that had once adored him. He released 2 solo albums that hinted at his remaining brilliance. But by 1970 he had stopped recording and performing publicly altogether, choosing instead the quiet, sheltered life of a recluse. He never really explained himself, and he never sought the spotlight again, leaving his fans to wonder what had happened to the radiant genius who had once seemed unstoppable. There were fleeting, eerie moments when the legend resurfaced, not on stage but in the corridors of fame, like a ghost refusing to leave the building. He would appear at Abbey Road Studios while his former bandmates were recording, carrying a large bag full of sweets, and wander silently through the rooms, unrecognised by the very people who had once been his closest collaborators. Witnesses recall how he would play old songs on the piano, but no one would even look at him. A man who had invented a world was now invisible inside it. The cruelty of this fate is almost unbearable to consider. Here was a founder of one of the most important bands in history, a man who had laid the very foundations of psychedelic rock, and he had become a shadow, a forgotten name in the halls where his legacy was being built without him. He was not a tragic hero who died young. He was a tragedy that unfolded slowly in a quiet house far from the roar of the crowds for 4 long decades. Before he finally succumbed to pancreatic cancer in 2006, he had already been gone for a lifetime, and his music had become a strange, beautiful artifact from a world that no longer existed. He had become the story of a light that burned so bright it consumed itself, and the question that lingers in the air, unspoken but heavy, is whether his disappearance was a tragic accident of the times or a deliberate choice to protect something fragile inside him. Was it the drugs that unmade him, or was it the very act of being so deeply seen by millions of people that broke the quiet soul behind the songs? By 1964, the Beach Boys were riding a wave of success so powerful it seemed nothing could stop them. Yet it was in that very year that Brian Wilson, the band's principal songwriter and architectural visionary, made a decision that stunned the music industry. He cancelled the entire tour, abruptly withdrawing from the stage at the peak of the band's commercial momentum. The official reason was nervous exhaustion, a condition that sounds almost quaint but was in reality a profound psychological collapse. He could no longer endure the relentless pressure of constant travel, performance, and the enormous weight of expectation pressing down on him. This wasn't a casual sabbatical, it was a full retreat, a desperate act of self-preservation from a man being consumed by his own creative machinery. For the next 12 years he would not perform live with the band, a silence that stretched from the height of surf rock into the dawn of a new decade. The most remarkable twist is that his retreat from the stage didn't signal the end of his genius, it actually set it free. Removed from the turmoil of touring, Wilson retreated to the recording studio, a sanctuary where he could construct his sonic visions without interruption. It was here, in 1966, that he would craft Pet Sounds, the album widely regarded as one of the most influential and artistically profound records of the 20th century. Working with a team of elite session musicians, he built intricate layers of sound that had never been attempted in popular music before, creating something so advanced it confounded his contemporaries. While his bandmates were playing to screaming crowds around the world, Wilson was in the studio, experimenting with theremins, bicycle bells and orchestras in a way that no one else had dared to imagine. The music was so revolutionary that it reportedly left Paul McCartney stunned, inspiring him to push the Beatles toward their own masterpiece, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Wilson's withdrawal was not an escape from his art, but rather a necessary retreat into it, a calculated shift in how he defined his own existence. His story forces a re-evaluation of what we perceive as a disappearance, suggesting that it's not always an ending but a strategic maneuver for survival. By stepping away from the performance circuit, Wilson was not killing his career, but rather saving his mind, trading the immediate gratification of applause for the lasting legacy of creation. Was this conscious decision the only way for him to protect the fragile brilliance that resided within him from being crushed by the industry's demands? The act of disappearing in his case was a form of defense, a way to control the narrative and preserve the very core of his identity. But perhaps the most profound element is what the fans and the public did with his silence. They built a mythology around it. In the absence of live appearances, his absence itself became a part of the band's story, a narrative void that amplified his mystique and fueled the curiosity of listeners for generations. It was a quiet, controlled form of rebellion that would prove to be vastly more successful than any tour could have been. This conscious choice stands in stark contrast to those artists whose careers were later shattered by forces entirely beyond their control, a fate that awaited the next great blues prodigy. In 1967, Peter Green was the most revered blues guitarist in Britain, a man whose tone made even Eric Clapton blush with humility. He had just formed Fleetwood Mac, naming the band after its rhythm section, and within months they were outselling the Beatles in the singles charts. His playing was pure, effortless, and loaded with a sorrow that seemed older than his 21 years. But then came Munich in 1970, and a single dose of LSD that cracked something fundamental inside him. He began to talk about wanting to give his money away, about seeing the world in colours no one else could perceive, and the music started to slip through his fingers. When he left Fleetwood Mac that same year, he left behind a band built entirely on his vision, a band that would go on to conquer the world without him. The diagnosis arrived soon after: schizophrenia, a label that followed him like a shadow through the next 2 decades. He spent years drifting, homeless at times, subjected to repeated electroshock treatments that further dulled the brilliance that had once lit up entire arenas. The man who had written Black Magic Woman and Albatross now lived in a quiet fog, occasionally emerging to play with strangers in small clubs, unrecognised and unreachable. It is a cruel irony that the substance which expanded the minds of a generation contracted his into a permanent twilight. And the question that haunts anyone who hears his story is simple. Was it the drug that broke him, or was it the weight of a genius that could only be carried for so long before it splintered? When he finally resurfaced in 1990 with the Splinter Group, he played with a ghostly grace, a shadow of his former self, but still unmistakably him. He earned a Grammy nomination in 1998, a quiet validation from an industry that had long since moved on. But the peace never fully held, and he retreated once more, a man who disappeared not once but twice, proving that for some artists the silence is never truly broken. The gentlest hands often hold the heaviest burdens, and Peter Green carried his until the very end. On the 1st of February 1995, a 31-year-old lyricist walked out of the Embassy Hotel in London and simply never came back, leaving behind a room that told its own unsettling story. Richey Edwards of the Manic Street Preachers had checked in just days earlier, but what he left in that room transformed a missing person's case into something far darker. He had carved the words "I am not here" into his own flesh, a ritual of self-destruction that his bandmates had witnessed before and could not stop. His car was discovered weeks later near the Severn Bridge, a notorious location for those choosing to end their lives. Yet his body was never recovered from the freezing waters below. The mystery deepened with every passing month, and the official declaration of his presumed death did not arrive until 2008, a full 13 years after that cold February morning. How does a man at the peak of his creative powers vanish so completely that even the river refuses to give him back? The clues he left behind painted a portrait of a man at war with his own mind, a war that had been raging long before the world knew his name. Friends and bandmates recalled his history of self-harm, the deep cuts he made without flinching, as if his own body were merely a canvas for his torment. The blood found in his hotel room was not a spontaneous act of despair, but the final stroke of a pattern that had haunted him for years, documented quietly in interviews and whispered conversations. Even as the music industry celebrated his sharp lyrics and magnetic presence, Edwards was slipping further into a private abyss that no amount of applause could fill. He had spoken openly about feeling like a fraud, about the suffocating weight of expectation, and about his fear that his best work was already behind him. The world saw a rock star on the brink of greatness, but he saw only a prisoner counting down the days until his release. What happened next was utterly unexpected, for his disappearance did not close the case but cracked it wide open into a cultural phenomenon that refuses to die. A subreddit dedicated to finding him was created in 2013, and even by 2024 it still boasted over 15,000 active members combing through old photographs, bank records, and eyewitness reports from across the globe. Some insist he was spotted in India, living as a monk under a different name, while others swear they saw him in a small Spanish village or working behind a bar in the Canary Islands. The theories multiply with every passing year, each one more elaborate than the last, and each one carrying the desperate hope of a fan base that cannot accept silence as an answer. His bandmates have long accepted his death, but the online community refuses to close the book, keeping the mystery alive with every new post. There are few spectacles in rock and roll quite like watching thousands of strangers dedicate years of their lives to a question that may never have an answer. The crowd had been roaring his name only months before, but on that bridge there was no audience, no cameras, no encore, only the cold grey water and the weight of a decision that could not be undone. And yet, in a strange and haunting way, his disappearance made him immortal, a ghost who continues to fascinate precisely because he never gave us the closure we crave. December 1997, a dusty Detroit demolition site, and a middle-aged man in work boots is swinging a sledgehammer, his identity completely unknown to the men working beside him. For nearly 2 decades, this man had been tearing down abandoned buildings for the city, a hard, anonymous labour that kept his family fed while he faded from the world's memory. But a world away in Cape Town, his face was plastered on bedroom walls, his voice the soundtrack of a generation's rebellion against apartheid. The man swinging that hammer was Sixto Rodriguez, an American musician whose 2 1970s albums had become platinum-selling anthems in South Africa, selling over 500,000 copies, a fact he would not learn for another year. The extraordinary twist in this story is that his fame was an ocean away, a secret kept from its very subject for almost 3 decades. While his records fueled the anti-apartheid movement and were as influential as the Beatles in that distant land, Rodriguez was living a life of severe obscurity, unaware of the legend he had become. It wasn't until 1997 that a dedicated South African fan, determined to uncover what had happened to his hero, traced him back to that demolition site in Detroit. The fan Stephen Sugar Segerman had heard a wild rumour that Rodriguez had died on stage, setting himself on fire, a myth that had grown in the absence of any real information about the artist. Rodriguez's story is a masterclass in the concept of a narrative void, demonstrating how a silence can amplify a legacy to legendary proportions. In the absence of any news from the musician himself, South African fans invented a tragic mythology that far surpassed his reality, creating a powerful folk hero out of a simple Detroit labourer. After being found, his return to fame was a gentle one. He played a handful of concerts in South Africa to massive adoring crowds, and his story was later immortalised in the 2012 Academy Award-winning documentary, Searching for Sugar Man. The film, which captured this incredible journey, brought his music to a whole new generation, proving a tale of quiet humility was as compelling as any invention. He continued to play music until his quiet death in 2023, a man who had finally caught up with the reality of his own greatness, leaving behind a legacy that redefined what it means to be a star, and leaving us to wonder what other silent legends might be walking among us right now. She had been the voice of a generation, the singular talent who made the world stop and listen. In 1998, Lauryn Hill released The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, and it did not just succeed, it detonated, selling over 19 million copies globally and cementing itself as a cultural landmark. Yet within 4 years, at the absolute peak of her powers, she vanished from the public eye, leaving a void that critics and fans alike have spent decades trying to explain. The conventional narrative points to the legal troubles that followed, including a 3-month prison sentence in 2013 for failing to pay taxes on roughly $1.8 million in income, as reported by the New York Times. But the real story, the one she would finally articulate in a 2014 interview with Rolling Stone, was far more personal. She felt exploited by the music industry and utterly stripped of creative control. The machine that had amplified her voice had also silenced it, and the pressure of that suffocating success became the very reason she chose to disappear. How does an artist survive when the thing they love most becomes the source of their deepest pain? For Hill, the answer was not to fight louder, but to walk away completely, a decision that transformed her into something rarer than a star. She became a mystery that the world could not stop trying to solve. By 1995, Dave Gahan had spent nearly a decade in the grip of a heroin addiction so severe that it had hollowed out the man millions knew as the frontman of Depeche Mode. He had been to rehab, but the band's relentless touring schedule had pulled him straight back into the dark, and his body was beginning to surrender to the abuse. On a night that year, in a hotel room, his heart stopped for the second time, and for a few terrifying minutes he was clinically dead, his pulse gone, his life hanging by the thinnest thread before paramedics managed to revive him. The man who had once commanded stadiums of screaming fans had been reduced to a fragile figure on a stretcher, his bandmates staring at him in disbelief. He later described that moment as a shock so profound that it felt like a physical blow, one that finally cracked through the fog of his addiction. What do you do when you have been given a second heartbeat you never expected to receive? That near-fatal collapse became the unexpected foundation of his entire recovery, a brutal line drawn between the man he had been and the man he was determined to become. He checked into a rehabilitation program in New York, where he spent months confronting the demons he had spent a decade trying to outrun, and crucially, he committed to it with a fierceness no one had seen in him before. He married for the 3rd time, settling into a stability that had always eluded him, and by 2001, he returned to the stage with Depeche Mode for the album Exciter, not as a broken survivor, but as a man reborn. The band, once on the verge of collapse, found a new lease on life through his clarity, and their tours became celebrations of a second chance, rather than memorials for a fallen star. His story, as told by Classic Rock magazine in 2021, is a testament to the sheer power of survival when the universe hands you a second chance. Some artists vanish because they lose their way, but Gahan vanished into the abyss, only to claw his way back with a grip that would not let go. His comeback was not about reclaiming fame, but about reclaiming his own breath, one day at a time. It is the rare story where the twist is not tragedy, but triumph in the face of an ending that seemed all but written. The music industry is littered with artists who vanished, but there is a far darker category, those who never got the chance to return at all. Brian Jones, a founding member of the Rolling Stones, was dismissed from his own band in June 1969 because his drug use had made him uncontrollable. Exactly 1 month later, the 27-year-old was found dead at the bottom of his swimming pool at Cochford Farm in Sussex, a tragedy documented by The Guardian in 2019. Jeff Buckley suffered a similar fate on May 29, 1997, when he drowned in the Wolf River in Memphis at just 30 years old, only 3 years after releasing his debut album Grace. The singer had decided to go for a swim while waiting for his band to arrive, and his body was discovered with his boots still on. Then there is Kurt Cobain, who never even had the chance to disappear, as he died in 1994 at the age of 27. Yet the commercial aftermath of his death reveals a strange and uncomfortable truth about the economics of fame. According to Rolling Stone in 2019, Nirvana has sold over 75 million albums worldwide since his death, a staggering jump from the roughly 25 million sold while he was still alive. This explosion in sales is not an isolated quirk, but a well-documented pattern that follows the sudden passing of a star. A 2011 study from the University of Sydney, published in the BMJ, found that rock musicians face a dramatically elevated risk of death within 5 years of achieving fame, with drug and alcohol-related fatalities occurring at a rate 17.7 times higher than the general population. The very success they chase often becomes the engine of their destruction, a paradox that leaves fans with nothing but a catalogue of what could have been. The silence that follows is permanent, and the applause turns into a dirge. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a career when the noise finally stops, and for Bob Dylan, it arrived on a July afternoon in 1966 when his Triumph motorcycle failed him near his home in Woodstock, New York. The crash was nowhere near fatal, yet it provided the perfect excuse to vanish, and he seized it, retreating into the countryside for 6 months to write more than 100 songs with the band. But some disappearances are not chosen. They are inflicted by the body itself, and Joni Mitchell understood that distinction better than most when a brain aneurysm in 2015 left her unable to speak or walk. She had already retreated from performing in 2000, worn down by a neurological condition that made the stage a kind of cruel theatre, and then the rupture stole nearly everything else. For 5 years she stayed hidden, her voice silent, her legend frozen, until the Newport Folk Festival in 2022 became the setting for a resurrection nobody dared to predict. The crowd that gathered to see a 79-year-old woman reclaim her songs was not there for nostalgia alone. They were witnessing proof that the story does not always end in a graveyard or a missing persons file. Then there is Peter Frampton, whose 1976 record sold over 8 million copies before fibromyalgia turned his guitar into an instrument of pain, forcing him to step away from the public eye entirely. He spent years believing the music was gone for good, until a new treatment gave his hands back, and he returned with an album that felt like a second chance at life. These are not tales of tragedy but of stubborn renewal, and they ask a quiet question worth sitting with. How much of what we call disappearance is really just the long, slow work of finding a way back? A 2024 study from the University of Exeter, published in the journal Psychology of Music, found that artists who vanish from the public eye are significantly more likely to be reappraised favourably after their quiet period, with careers rated over 20% higher after 5 to 10 years of absence. This is the absence makes the heart grow fonder effect, quantified for the first time. And it suggests that disappearing isn't just an escape hatch. It's a powerful, if unintentional, career strategy. But what is actually happening inside the fan's mind during that silence? A 2023 study from the University of California, Berkeley, published in Psychological Science, which surveyed 100 people, revealed that when an artist vanishes, the fan's brain creates what researchers call a narrative void, a space where the imagination runs wild, inventing both darker and brighter scenarios than reality could ever provide, and this void dramatically deepens the emotional bond when the artist finally returns. So the absence itself becomes a kind of creative collaboration. However, the industry data tells a more complex strategic story. A 2023 report from the market research firm Media Research shows that while artists who disappear for over 5 years see a 35% higher rate of old fans returning to their music, they only manage to attract 8% more new fans, meaning a vanishing act is a powerful tool for retention, but a very poor one for growth. Yet, the biggest promoters in the world have noticed a seismic shift because the live entertainment giant Live Nation reported in its 2023 annual report that ticket sales for returning artists who had been gone for more than 5 years were up 67% compared to their pre-disappearance tours, turning the comeback tour into the industry's most reliable revenue stream. This is where the art of the strategic retreat comes into focus, and the research offers a clear 3-step lesson for anyone who feels the urge to step back, whether an artist or not, because a successful disappearance is not about a sudden chaotic exit, but about a deliberate, preparatory one. The first step is to listen to your inner signal before the breaking point, because the data from these case studies shows that most of these vanishings were not planned maneuvers but emergency ejections, and the artists who did it best were the ones who recognized the need to leave before the crisis made the decision for them. The second step is to understand that true absence is total, so a half presence, where you're lurking on social media or releasing the occasional half-finished track, doesn't create the same narrative void and prevents the romanticized memory from forming. The third step is to plan your return as carefully as you planned your exit, because the Live Nation data is clear that the comeback is a career event in itself, one that demands anticipation, surprise, and a story that helps the audience fill in the gaps of the years you were gone. So, what does this tell us about the grand final act of a disappearing artist? The silence isn't just an escape, it's a statement that echoes louder than any chord. The silence was never an ending, not for the ones who truly mattered. A 2020 Pew Research Center study found that 60% of Americans can no longer name the songs of artists who vanished for over a decade, yet they can still hum every note perfectly. The music outlives the noise, the absence outlives the presence. We chase the story of the disappearance, but we keep the melody long after the mystery fades. For Syd Barrett, for Peter Green, for Richey Edwards, the vanishing act was a shield, a desperate way to protect the fragile thing inside from a world that wanted to consume it whole. We called it madness or selfishness, but maybe it was the only sane answer to a machine that never stops asking for more. The Silence was their last true album, and we have been replaying it ever since, trying to find the hidden track that explains everything. And perhaps that is the truest lesson of all. In an age where everyone is screaming for attention, to disappear becomes the final, unanswerable statement. So tell me, which artist have you been waiting for, and what do you think they would say if they finally came back?